In the turbulent centuries following the fall of Rome, monastic communities emerged as beacons of stability and renewal across Western Europe. Anchored by the balanced vision of Saint Benedict's rule where prayer and work formed the twin pillars of daily life, these houses of devotion transcended mere ascetic retreat to become engines of spiritual vitality, intellectual preservation, and economic innovation. Manuscript-filled Scriptoria and growing libraries safeguarded both sacred texts and classical heritage, while missionary foundations from Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England carried faith and learning into pagan territories. At the same time, disciplined labor on monastic estates introduced advanced agricultural techniques, transforming uncultivated lands into thriving communities and reshaping medieval society's relationship to work. By integrating contemplative practice with practical enterprise and outreach, Western monasteries not only preserved the legacy of antiquity, but also sowed the seeds for the cultural and intellectual revival that would define the High Middle Ages. Welcome to Globe Threads, where we explore the defining moments that wove our world together. Throughout the early Middle Ages, monasticism emerged as one of the most dynamic and influential forces within the Western Church and society. Monastic communities were not merely enclaves of prayer and asceticism. They were pivotal centers of learning, economic activity, missionary endeavor, and cultural preservation, profoundly shaping the spiritual, intellectual, and material landscape of Europe. The foundation for the widespread influence of Western monasticism was largely laid by Saint Benedict of Nursia, circa 480 circa 547 AD. Around 529 AD, Benedict founded the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy and, more significantly, composed his Regula, Rule, a guide for monastic living that would become the dominant framework for religious communities throughout Western Europe for centuries. Benedict is rightly considered the father of Western Christian monasticism. The Rule of Saint Benedict was characterized by its wisdom, moderation, and practicality. It emphasized a communal life lived under the authority of an abbot, who was to be elected by the monks and to govern with both firmness and paternal care. Prospective monks underwent a probationary year before taking vows of stability, a commitment to remain in that particular monastery for life, conversion of manners, a commitment to the monastic way of life, and obedience to the rule and the abbot. Personal possessions were renounced, fostering a spirit of communal ownership and detachment from worldly goods. A key feature of the Benedictine rule was its balanced daily schedule, famously summarized by the later motto Ora et Labora, pray and work. The day was structured around the Opus Dei, the work of God, which consisted of the canonical hours of communal prayer and psalmody. This was complemented by periods of manual labor, essential for the monastery's self-sufficiency, and Lectio Divina, sacred reading, which involved the prayerful study of Scripture and the Church Fathers. The rule provided detailed instructions for all aspects of monastic life, from the duties of monastic officials like the prior, deputy abbot, cellarer, in charge of provisions, novice master and guest master, to the treatment of the sick and guests, and the procedures for discipline. Beyond its practical organization, the rule offered profound spiritual guidance, emphasizing virtues such as humility, silence, and obedience as pathways to spiritual growth. Its inherent discretion, allowing for adaptation to the differing needs and capacities of individuals based on age, health, or spiritual development, made it more humane and sustainable than some of the harsher, more ascetic monastic rules that existed at the time. This combination of structure, spiritual depth, and adaptability accounts for its widespread adoption and enduring influence. The Benedictine rule's emphasis on stability, stabilitas loci, was a particularly transformative innovation. Unlike some earlier monastic traditions in the East or the Celtic West, which sometimes featured more eremitical, solitary, or peripatetic wandering monks, Benedictinism prioritized commitment to a specific community and place. This stability was crucial for the long-term success and societal impact of Benedictine houses. It allowed for the accumulation of resources, libraries, cultivated lands, specialized skills, and the undertaking of long-term projects like large-scale manuscript copying, agricultural development, and the establishment of schools. A wandering ascetic could not easily build and maintain a library or manage a complex agricultural estate over generations. This institutional permanence enabled Benedictine monasteries to become powerful economic engines, centers for agricultural innovation and land reclamation, and reliable repositories of knowledge. They thus became deeply embedded in the medieval landscape, serving as consistent partners for secular rulers and profoundly shaping their surrounding regions in ways that more transient forms of monasticism could not. Furthermore, the rule's integration of spiritual discipline with practical labor, ora et labora, had a significant impact beyond the cloister walls. In a society where manual labor was often disdained and associated with servitude in the classical past, the Benedictine model dignified work by making it an integral part of the spiritual life and a means of serving God and the community. This not only ensured the economic self-sufficiency of the monasteries, but also fostered a positive work ethic. Monasteries became pioneers in agricultural techniques such as crop rotation, irrigation, viticulture, and animal husbandry, and also contributed to technological advancements like the use of watermills and improved metallurgical practices. Their success in transforming uncultivated lands into productive estates demonstrated the value of organized, disciplined labor. Consequently, Benedictine monasteries acted as economic catalysts, contributing to the gradual economic recovery and agricultural development of Western Europe and influencing broader societal attitudes towards work. In an era marked by political fragmentation, social upheaval, and a general decline in secular literacy, monasteries emerged as the primary centers for the preservation and cultivation of learning in Western Europe. They became, as described, major conduits of civilization, safeguarding not only religious doctrine, but also the intellectual and artistic heritage of classical antiquity. At the heart of this intellectual enterprise were the monastic Scriptoria, dedicated writing rooms where monks painstakingly copied manuscripts by hand. This laborious work was essential for the survival and transmission of a vast range of texts. Monks copied the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, especially Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, and Gregory the Great, liturgical books necessary for worship, and, significantly, numerous works of classical Latin literature, including those by authors such as Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, and Aristotle. Without these monastic efforts, a substantial portion of this classical heritage would likely have been lost to posterity. The very act of copying was often viewed as a spiritual discipline, a form of meditation on the sacred texts. Beyond simple copying, many manuscripts were beautifully illuminated with intricate designs and illustrations, transforming them into works of art as well as repositories of text. Monasteries also developed significant libraries to house their growing collections of manuscripts. These libraries were not merely passive archives, but active centers of study and education, primarily for the formation of their own monastic brethren, but also, in many cases, offering instruction to external students, including those destined for clerical roles elsewhere, or even sons of the nobility. Monastic schools, therefore, played a crucial role in maintaining a literate class and providing the educational foundation for future generations of clergy and scholars. The process of selecting which texts to copy and preserve, while partly dictated by the availability of exemplars, was also undoubtedly influenced by the intellectual and spiritual priorities of the monastic communities. There was a natural focus on texts essential for Christian faith and practice. However, the preservation of pagan classical authors suggests a recognition of their value for education in rhetoric, grammar, philosophy, or simply as part of the esteemed cultural heritage of Rome. This selection process, whether conscious or circumstantial, effectively curated the body of classical literature that was transmitted to later medieval and Renaissance scholars. The filter of monastic scriptoria thus shaped the intellectual inheritance of the West, often framing classical texts within a Christian interpretive context. The culture of literacy and scholarship fostered within monasteries was indispensable for the institutional coherence and operational effectiveness of the wider church. A geographically dispersed organization like the church required written communication, standardized liturgical texts, collections of canon law, and an educated clergy capable of administration, teaching, and pastoral care. The skills honed in monastic scriptoria, careful copying, attention to detail, mastery of Latin, were directly transferable to ecclesiastical administration. The knowledge preserved and studied within monastic walls helped to create a shared intellectual and theological framework across the diverse regions and cultures of Western Christendom, contributing to a sense of unity despite political fragmentation. This intellectual infrastructure, nurtured within the cloister, was a key factor in the Church's ability to maintain its institutional integrity, exert broad influence, and lay the foundations for the later emergence of universities, many of which originated from or were significantly influenced by the traditions of monastic and cathedral schools. 1. The expansion of Christianity and the consolidation of church structures in early medieval Europe owed a great deal to the fervent missionary activities undertaken by monks, particularly those originating from Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England. These monks often ventured into pagan territories or areas where Christian practice was weak, establishing monastic centers that served as bases for evangelization and cultural transformation. Irish missions, spearheaded by figures like Saint Columbanus, circa 543 to 615 AD, were characterized by a distinctive form of asceticism, a strong emphasis on scholarship, and a unique penitential system. Around 590 AD, Columbanus, accompanied by 12 companions, embarked on a mission to the continent, founding influential monasteries such as Luxeuil in the Frankish kingdom of Burgundy and later Bobbio in Lombard Italy. These foundations became renowned centers of learning and spiritual discipline. The Irish monastic rule that Columbanus taught, along with the penitential practices he promoted, which emphasized private confession to a priest, followed by prescribed penances, had a lasting impact on the devotional life of Western Europe. Irish missionaries were known for their austerity and their learning, but their adherence to certain Celtic Christian traditions, such as a different method for calculating the date of Easter and distinct tonsure, sometimes brought them into conflict with the Frankish episcopate and the emerging Roman norms. Nevertheless, their impact was profound, with Bobbio, for example, becoming a major repository of classical and ecclesiastical knowledge. Anglo-Saxon missions followed, often building on the groundwork laid by the Irish, but increasingly operating in closer alignment with the papacy and the Frankish rulers. Figures like Saint Willibrord, 658 to 739 AD, undertook missions to the Frisians and Thuringians. Even more significant was Saint Boniface, born Winfrith, 675 to 754 AD, often hailed as the Apostle of Germany. A disciple of Willibrord, Boniface dedicated his life to preaching Christianity to the pagan Germanic tribes of Hesse, Thuringia, and Bavaria, and also to reforming the existing Frankish church along more ordered, Roman lines. His work was strongly supported by the Carolingian mayors of the palace, notably Charles Martel, and later by his sons Pippin III and Karl Pinneman, who saw the Christianization and organization of these territories as beneficial to their political aims. Boniface founded or restructured bishoprics on a Roman model, established monasteries as centers of evangelization and learning, and played a crucial role in convening the first councils of the German Church, such as the Concilium Germanicum in 742 AD. His famous act of felling Thor's oak at Geismar was a dramatic and symbolic challenge to pagan beliefs, demonstrating the power of the Christian God. Throughout his ministry, Boniface maintained very close ties with Rome, frequently seeking papal guidance and authority for his actions, thereby strengthening the link between the newly evangelized areas and the papacy. The efforts of these missionary monks, including figures like St. Augustine of Canterbury, who was sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert the Anglo-Saxons, were instrumental in extending the reach of Catholic Christianity into northern and central Europe. An important internal development within the British Isles, the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, marked a significant step in the integration of the Celtic Church into the Roman ecclesiastical structure, aligning practices in areas like the dating of Easter with those of Rome. This had long-term implications for the orientation of the English Church and its subsequent missionary endeavors, ensuring that Anglo-Saxon missionaries like Boniface would champion Roman usages on the continent. The distinct approaches of the Irish and Anglo-Saxon missions created a dynamic interplay that ultimately enriched and shaped the character of Western European Christianity. The Irish tradition, with its profound scholarship, rigorous asceticism, and influential penitential system, emphasized individual spiritual discipline and the pursuit of learning. The Anglo-Saxon missions, increasingly operating in concert with Rome and Frankish political power, focused more on institutional organization, doctrinal uniformity according to Roman standards, and the integration of newly converted territories into a broader papal and imperial framework. These differing emphases were not always mutually exclusive, but represented distinct currents within the broader missionary movement. The eventual ascendancy of the Roman model, facilitated by events like the Synod of Whitby and the systematic work of figures like Boniface, did not entirely efface the contributions of the Irish. Irish learning continued to permeate continental scholarship, and their penitential practices left an indelible mark on the sacrament of reconciliation in the Western Church. The synthesis of these diverse influences contributed to the unique texture and vitality of medieval Western Christianity. The success of these monastic missions was, to a very large extent, contingent upon the political support and patronage of local rulers. Boniface's deep reliance on Frankish protection and authority is a prime example of this symbiosis. Rulers often perceived the establishment of an organized church and the conversion of their populations as means to unify disparate territories, legitimize their own rule through divine sanction, and introduce elements of Romanized civilization, including literacy and administrative structures. This alliance was mutually beneficial. Missionaries gained access to territories, resources, and crucial protection, while rulers acquired literate administrators, a unifying ideology that transcended tribal loyalties and the Church's moral and spiritual endorsement of their authority. The conversion of a territory frequently signified its closer political alignment with, or even incorporation into, the sponsoring kingdom. This profound interdependence meant that the geographical and cultural expansion of Christianity was often inextricably linked with political expansion and consolidation. It also resulted in the Church becoming deeply embedded within the feudal power structures of Europe, a development that brought immense influence but also laid the groundwork for future challenges related to secular interference in ecclesiastical affairs, such as the contentious issue of lay investiture. Beyond their spiritual and intellectual contributions, monasteries in the early Middle Ages played a remarkably significant economic role, functioning as pivotal centers of agriculture, production, and technological innovation. Their disciplined communal structure and emphasis on self-sufficiency drove them to become highly effective economic enterprises. Monasteries typically held substantial tracts of land, often granted by pious rulers and nobles. The Benedictine ethos of ora et labora, pray and work, meant that manual labor, particularly in farming and animal husbandry, was an integral part of monastic life. As a result, monastic communities became pioneers in agricultural techniques. They are credited with developing or disseminating practices such as systematic crop rotation, improved irrigation methods, viticulture, cultivation of grapevines for wine, essential for the Eucharist and as a valuable commodity, and advanced animal rearing. Their need for food preservation, especially to sustain the community through winter months and periods of fasting, led them to become experts in methods like meat curing and sausage making. Monks were often at the forefront of turning wilderness into cultivated lands, clearing forests, draining swamps, and bringing new areas under productive agricultural use. The economic impact of monasteries extended beyond agriculture. They engaged in various forms of craftsmanship, producing goods not only for their own use, but also for trade. This could include textiles, metalwork, and, famously, the copying and illumination of manuscripts which, while primarily a scholarly activity, also produced valuable artifacts. Monasteries also contributed to technological advancements, for example, through the construction and use of watermills and windmills for grinding grain and other purposes, and developments in metallurgy. The meticulous record-keeping often associated with monastic administration also contributed to more efficient estate management. Studies of Benedictine landholdings, for instance in post-conquest England, suggest that these monastic estates often exhibited better economic performance and utilized superior technology, such as plows and mills, compared to lands controlled by secular lords. This superior performance can be attributed to their unique governance structure, which often involved an elected abbot and chapter meetings for discussing important matters, potentially leading to more stable and effective long-term management. The economic success of monasteries, particularly those following the Benedictine rule, stemmed from a unique confluence of factors: deep spiritual discipline that translated into dedicated labor, a communal organization that pooled resources and expertise, and an institutional continuity that transcended individual lifetimes, allowing for long-term planning and investment. Unlike secular estates that might be fragmented by inheritance, diminished by profligate lords, or lost in warfare, monasteries as corporate bodies could maintain and develop their lands and enterprises over many generations. Their commitment to improving their holdings, often viewed as a form of stewardship of God's creation, led to sustained agricultural development and the adoption or innovation of more efficient technologies. This stability and focus on productivity made them models of estate management. The monastic role in land reclamation and agricultural expansion was a critical factor in the physical and demographic growth of Christian Europe during the early Middle Ages. By spearheading the transformation of uncultivated lands into productive farms, monasteries literally expanded the arable land available, which in turn could support larger populations. This often led to the establishment of new settlements around monastic centers, pushing the frontiers of cultivated, and by extension, civilized and Christianized territory. This process of internal colonization, frequently initiated or strongly supported by monastic foundations, was fundamental to the socio-economic development of medieval European society. It laid the essential economic groundwork for the flourishing of the High Middle Ages, and, in doing so, also significantly altered the European landscape. However, the considerable wealth accumulated by successful monasteries also, at times, made them targets for acquisitive secular rulers and could lead to internal challenges, such as a departure from their original ascetic ideals or disputes over resources. The theological landscape of the Western Church between 500 and 750 AD was characterized by the profound and enduring influence of St. Augustine of Hippo, whose thought provided the primary categories and questions for much of the theological reflection of the era. The main intellectual endeavor was often focused on the preservation, interpretation, and application of this inherited tradition, particularly concerning the doctrines of grace, sin, and the nature of the sacraments. The theology of St. Augustine was paramount in shaping Western Christian understanding on fundamental issues. His teachings on the absolute necessity of divine grace for salvation, the concept of original sin and its effects on humanity, the complexities of predestination, and the objective efficacy of the sacraments, which he argued depended on Christ's action rather than the moral worthiness of the minister, formed the bedrock of theological discourse. The early medieval period was largely occupied with the reception, interpretation, and defense of this Augustinian heritage. The Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers were considered the twin principal sources of divine truth, viewed not as separate authorities but as flowing from a single, continuous stream of revelation. The prevailing theological objective was more often the faithful transmission and safeguarding of these established truths, rather than the pursuit of novel doctrinal developments or speculative theology. Despite the overarching authority of Augustine, his complex teachings, particularly on grace and free will, continued to be debated and refined. The Semi-Pelagian controversies, which had roots in the 5th century with figures like John Cassian and Vincent of Lerins, persisted in various forms into the 6th century. These discussions centered on the precise relationship between divine grace and human free will in the process of salvation. While those termed Semi-Pelagians rejected Pelagius's denial of the necessity of grace, they also expressed reservations about what they perceived as the more extreme implications of Augustine's views on predestination, arguing for a greater role for human initiative in the initial movement towards faith. Figures like Caesarius of Arles, early 6th century, were instrumental in defending and clarifying Augustinian positions, notably at the Council of Orange in 529 AD, which affirmed the necessity of prevenient grace, grace that precedes human action, but moderated some of the starker interpretations of predestination. The understanding and practice of the sacraments were also subject to ongoing reflection, though systematic sacramental theology would flourish more fully in later centuries. Augustine's principle that the sacraments derived their efficacy from Christ, ex opere operato, rather than from the moral character of the minister, ex opere operantis, was a crucial legacy, ensuring the objective validity of sacramental acts within the Church. However, the precise nature of Christ's presence in the Eucharist, for example, while affirmed, would become a subject of more intense debate later, with Augustine's emphasis on a spiritual presence serving as one important strand of thought. The dominance of Augustine in the West, while providing a powerful and coherent theological system that fostered stability, may have inadvertently contributed to a certain narrowing of the range of theological exploration for a period. This made the Western Church potentially less immediately receptive to, or fully cognizant of, differing theological emphases and methodologies prevalent in the Eastern Church, which drew from a wider array of Greek fathers and distinct philosophical traditions. This Augustinian lens could have subtly contributed to the theological misunderstandings that later fueled controversies such as the Filioque debate, where different Trinitarian starting points and terminologies, heavily influenced by Augustine in the West, led to divergent conclusions and, eventually, accusations of heresy. Nevertheless, the ongoing debates concerning grace and free will, even within an Augustinian framework, demonstrate that early medieval theology was not a passive or monolithic reception of past ideas. Theologians actively grappled with the profound implications of Augustine's thought, particularly concerning divine sovereignty and human agency. These were not merely abstract intellectual exercises, but had significant practical consequences for understanding the path to salvation, the nature of pastoral care, and the core of Christian life. These internal Western discussions, while generally resolved in ways that upheld a broadly Augustinian perspective, as confirmed by councils like Orange, served to refine and solidify Western theological positions. They also underscore that orthodoxy was often forged and clarified through controversy and conciliar deliberation, rather than being simply inherited without question. While the formal dogmatic definitions of major Marian doctrines, such as the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption, occurred much later in Church history, the early Middle Ages, 500 to 750 AD, and beyond, witnessed a significant growth in popular devotion to the Virgin Mary and the emergence of liturgical feasts in her honor. This period laid crucial groundwork for subsequent Mariological developments. Belief in the Assumption of Mary, the teaching that Mary, at the end of her earthly life, was taken body and soul into heavenly glory, became increasingly widespread across both Eastern and Western Christendom from the 6th century onwards. This belief found expression in liturgical celebrations, with the Feast of the Assumption being commemorated on August 15th in both traditions. The origins of the doctrine and Feast of the Immaculate Conception, Mary's preservation from original sin from the moment of her own conception, are more complex and developed gradually. Liturgical celebration of the Conception of Mary, referring to St. Anne's Conception of Mary, began to appear in England from the 9th century. While the full theological formulation of the Immaculate Conception as a doctrine exempting Mary from original sin would be articulated more clearly by later theologians, such as Edmer in the late 11th, early 12th century, and definitively by Duns Scotus, the early medieval period saw the beginnings of a heightened awareness of Mary's unique sanctity and purity. The growing prominence of devotion to Mary was, in part, linked to Christological considerations. The affirmation of Mary as Theotokos, God-bearer, or Mother of God, at the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD, was crucial. This title underscored the Orthodox teaching on the Incarnation, that Jesus Christ was truly God and truly man, born of a human mother. In a context where Arianism, which denied Christ's full divinity, had been a significant challenge, Devotion to Mary as the Mother of God served to reinforce Christ's divine status. The monastic tradition, particularly the Benedictines in the West, played a key role in fostering and disseminating Marian piety during this period. Monastic writers composed hymns, prayers, and theological reflections on Mary, contributing to the deepening of Marian devotion among the clergy and, through them, the laity. While major Eastern figures like Ephraim the Syrian and John Damascene were significant champions of Marian devotion, whose influence also permeated the West, indigenous Western monastic contributions were also vital. The rise of Marian devotion and the establishment of feasts like the Assumption, often developing organically from popular piety and flourishing within monastic traditions before receiving full theological articulation or official dogmatic definition, illustrates a significant dynamic in the history of Christian doctrine. It shows an interplay between the lived spirituality of the faithful, both lay and monastic, and the formal teachings of the Church. Popular religious sentiment and devotional practices, especially when nurtured within influential centers like monasteries, frequently outpaced systematic theological formulation. The Church, in many instances, eventually recognized, formalized, and provided theological grounding for pre-existing beliefs and practices that had already taken deep root and resonated profoundly with the Christian community. This dynamic reveals that doctrinal development is not always a strictly top-down process initiated by ecclesiastical authorities. The spiritual experiences and devotional expressions of the wider church community can significantly shape the theological agenda and contribute to the eventual articulation of formal doctrines. It also highlights how certain beliefs and devotional practices could become deeply embedded in Christian culture and identity long before they were officially defined as dogmas, becoming integral to the fabric of Christian life. Furthermore, the increasing emphasis on Mary's unique holiness and her pivotal role as Theotokos was not merely an expression of affection or veneration for Mary herself. It also served as a critical theological bulwark for Christological orthodoxy. By honoring Mary as the Mother of God and emphasizing her exceptional sanctity, the Church reinforced its core teaching on the Incarnation that Jesus was, in one person, both fully divine and fully human, born of a human mother. Veneration of Mary thus became an indirect way of affirming Christ's true nature and upholding the orthodox understanding of his person against any lingering Arian, denial of full divinity, or Nestorian-like, separating the divine and human in Christ, tendencies. In this sense, Marian devotion played an important polemical and catechetical role in the early medieval Church, serving not just as a sentimental or devotional outgrowth, but as a theological support for fundamental Christological truths during a period when these truths were still being consolidated and defended against various interpretations. As the early Middle Ages drew to a close, the multifaceted legacy of monasticism had become inseparable from the spiritual, intellectual, and socio-economic fabric of Western Christendom. From the disciplined regularity and communal stability introduced by the rule of Saint Benedict to the missionary zeal of Irish and Anglo-Saxon monks, monastic communities forged enduring institutions that transcended the tumult of post-Roman Europe. Their scriptoria and libraries not only preserved the textual heritage of antiquity, but also laid the groundwork for the rise of cathedral schools and, eventually, the first medieval universities. Through a harmonious integration of prayer and labor, monasteries dignified manual work, spearheaded agricultural innovation, and managed vast estates with a level of continuity and expertise unmatched by secular lords. Equally important was the role of monastic devotion and theological reflection in shaping the Church's doctrinal contours. The burgeoning cult of Mary and the consolidation of Augustinian theology within monastic circles helped to reinforce core Christological and soteriological truths at a time when the Western Church sought both internal unity and external influence. Monasteries became crucibles of liturgical creativity, penance practices, and pastoral care, embedding a rich devotional life across Europe's diverse peoples. Meanwhile, the interaction between monastic and episcopal authorities gradually wove a tighter ecclesiastical network, linking remote cloisters to the papal center in Rome and strengthening the institutional coherence of the Church. Together, these spiritual, intellectual, and economic achievements underscore how monasticism functioned as a dynamic catalyst for the transformation of medieval Europe. By preserving classical learning, advancing agrarian and industrial techniques, disseminating devotional practices, and championing missionary outreach, monks and nuns not only sustained the remnants of the Roman heritage, but also sowed the seeds for the cultural renewal of the High Middle Ages. Their enduring influence would resonate through the Carolingian Renaissance, the flowering of scholasticism, and the emergence of medieval Christendom as a cohesive civilization testimony to the profound power of a way of life that married contemplation with action, solitude with community, and faith with works.